Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Tonight our topic is Women's Studies. With me tonight is Liz Kennedy. Liz is an assistant professor in American Studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo. She is a founding member of the Women's Studies College and a member of the governance board of the Women's Studies program at SUNY at Buffalo. Also with me is Catherine Stimpson. She is an associate professor of English at Barnard College in New York City. And Kate is editor of Signs, a journal of women and culture in our society. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Women's studies is a thing that's been growing progressively over the last few years. Do you have any figures as to how many there are now?
Well, I tell you, Sandy, in order to really understand these figures, you have to remember that things do not move slowly in the academic world, so that the rate of change is especially high because the academic world has never been known for its rate of change. But 5 years ago, there was recorded 17 what we call women's studies courses. Now, at the last count, there were 4,628, I believe. 5 years ago, there were 2 programs. At the last count, there were 112 programs. And there's also, in terms of academic practices, this is important, they're going in 2 directions. That women's studies is being seen as important in graduate schools, and also there's an effort to make the insights of women's studies known in secondary schools and even in elementary schools. So that what those of us who believe in women's studies hope we're doing is not only increasing the number of courses, but diffusing our discoveries throughout the entire, well, educational bureaucracy.
There have been a lot of myths about women's studies, haven't there? I mean, there are things that people say when you bring up women's studies.
A lot of myths about women.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess all of us who work in it know those myths very well. Probably the most common one is that, well, why do you need women's studies? Is it just counseling? And of course, that's not what we're about. I think another one that people raise all the time is, well, you just need to change a few words in a textbook or change an emphasis in a course, and if you've had women's studies for a year, then these things will change and you won't need women's studies very much longer. And of course we don't think that. And I don't know, what's important about it for us is that you've got to change the institution. And it's very hard for people in the institution to understand that we're going to have to be around for 50 or 60, 70 years until the power structure changes.
Just let me take what you said, if I can, and go back for a minute. That, well, the average, well, is there such a thing as an average person? No, of course not. But a conventional response that we all get in women's studies, to women's studies, is, well, not only what you said, what's the point of it, but also that it's trivial, it's not necessary. That people who are interested in women's studies are interested in something that doesn't matter, and their interest in it is perhaps a reflection of the fact that they can't do anything else. But when we talk about women's studies, what we're really talking about, I think, is a profound movement in intellectual life with enormous social and political ramifications. And I would say, though there's a great deal of diversity in women's studies, everybody who participates in them and practices in them agrees on 3 things. That what we have inherited about women, what we've been taught about women, is just false. It's not only false, it's often dangerously false. It's a series of errors that does real harm to women and by extension to men. So there's a need for compensatory scholarship. I think a second principle we agree on is that this intellectual movement we call women's studies is helping us to rethink the whole body of knowledge. We're not just correcting errors, but we're trying to look at things in a new way. And then a third thing I think we all agree on, which is what you just said, is that the institutions themselves have to be, oh, one word for it is restructured, Liz's good word for it is transformed, but that the institutions in which men and women have been educated, from kindergarten up through graduate school to continuing education programs to private think tanks to the government, any institution that we've held responsible for the transmission and communication of knowledge has been bad for women in terms of what they've taught about women, and in terms of how they've taught women, and in the way they've treated women as scholars and as administrators.
Yeah, I think a lot of times why people move to trivialize the work is that the problems with in the institution with women are so great that to admit that is to totally delegitimize the past education. And I think the other side of that is how big the task is and how hard we're going to have to work, and why it's so important that we're connected to a movement that is going to keep pushing for those changes. It's not just an accident that women have been excluded from the areas of study, both in terms of work and in terms of being their role in history being analyzed. The task is so great, we've got to keep pushing, and there are forces working against us all the time.
Oh yes, I mean, Liz and I could sit here and just give you a Reader's Digest of horror stories of what it's like to work in women's studies. But I don't know if we want to stress the negative. But
Probably not.
But it's difficult. But one reason why many of us in women's studies are so excited about it is there is so much to learn, because we are dealing with half the population in terms of the past, in terms of the present, and hopefully in terms of the future. And women's lives, one of the things we're learning, I think, is the enormous diversity of women's lives. How much we have to learn, because how complicated, how intricate, how interesting, and how valuable those lives have been.
For a minute, let's talk about the history of the women's studies movement as it relates to the history of the women's movement.
Mm.
I mean, how influential has the women's movement been? I mean, is that the reason women's studies exist? Is that the reason we're raising some of the questions we're raising?
Well, at least in the case of Buffalo, it was clear that the program started in spring '71. And if people remember, that was a time when the women's movement was blossoming in terms of people beginning work on affirmative action, beginning to do health projects, beginning to raise issues about rape, the beginning of publications nationally. And it's very clear that faculty, students, and staff in the university said, well, we have to change the rest of the society, and this institution is putting forward the ideas that in fact are affecting the way the rest of the population thinks about us, and therefore we're going to change this institution. And I know that's why we got the support we did to get the kind of program forward, because women were angry and they were tired of hearing the same old stuff in their classes, being forced to do the same old kinds of research papers that looked down on them. So it would seem to me that in our program, that the women's movement is instrumental in starting us and in putting us forward. And I think the fact the increase of programs around the country is related to the women's movement, and the increase in the number of journals, the increase in the kinds of scholarship would seem to be related to the women's movement right now. Wouldn't you agree, Kate?
I would agree. I think it's an important question and a complicated question. One thing we do know is that there were people studying women in responsible ways before the new feminism, and I guess we can roughly date the new feminism to 63 or 64. And we know, we can look back, we can see books like Margaret Mead's Male and Female, which, to whatever errors it might have, was nevertheless an influential book. But what we began the program by talking about is the burgeoning of women's studies. Its enormous increase, the quantity as well as the quality of the work that's being done. And yes, I think the women's movement has been extremely influential. I think there would be scholarship about women without the women's movement. I don't think there would be a women's studies movement without the women's movement. The women's movement as a political and social movement has, as Liz said, it's given energy to women's studies. And in a sense, and I'm going to be careful now, but in a sense we can see women's studies as the academic arm of the women's movement. Now, there's one thing I don't want to be misunderstood on, People say that women's studies is nothing but political. And when they attack it in that way, what I think they mean is all that's going on in that classroom is armed guards of women are being prepared to go out and kill us guys. That's a vulgarization, of course. There is a good deal of women's studies that is research. Strong, clear research with no immediate and direct political end. But which is not to say that the women's movement has not been, in large part, responsible for the enormous energy of women's studies. And of course what's happening is what people are doing in the women's studies classroom is making exactly the same kind of analysis of society, of culture, and of concepts that the women's movement is making of our political and social institutions.
Let's talk about the women's studies programs in terms of the students and the people that it should be responsive to.
Well, I think it's just going to add that the women's movement, women's studies for the women's movement is more than an intellectual arm. What it's doing is transforming the education of students. And I don't think we can underestimate that. I think myself, that I first came to understand myself as a woman really by the time I was 30. And the fact that students starting at 18 are beginning to understand why the society views them the way they are. They're beginning to learn how to fight back to say that we don't want to be viewed like this, that students are beginning to realize that all women are not the same in this society, that there are black women, there are working class women, there are lesbians, and that the realities of our women's lives are necessary for building and transforming society. I think that that's really important, and I think that's what a women's studies program does.
I think we should realize, though, that there is a diversity in the kinds of women's studies programs.
Right.
Those 4,628 courses we mentioned, those 112
They're not all the same with the same formula, are they?
They're not. They don't have the same formula. They don't have the same governing structures, and they don't have the same sense of a relationship between scholarship and an ongoing political movement. The Buffalo program is one of the best programs in the country, and would it be fair to say, Liz, that it has a very clear, explicit, and strong sense of its direct relationship to the women's movement as a social and political movement working for radical change.
All right, now if you can.
There are other programs, of which I am one, in which the focus is on more traditional scholarship, in which women is in a sense a new content with old forms, although we all seek to enhance and to alter the lives of our students. With the more traditional programs, it's kind of a trickle-down theory of knowledge. If eventually knowledge will work for social good, but it will be more indirect.
What about harassment? Now there seems to be a large acceptance in the general population of women's studies. That seems not to be true on the campus, within the university administrations. And many women's studies programs are having a lot of trouble surviving. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think it's extraordinary the amount of harassment we receive in Buffalo, that the administration never pays attention to the fact that we do have a national reputation. And I assume it's got to do with the fact that the more effective women are in getting together, the more people on the local level are frightened that there is going to be real change. I'm not sure that nationally there has been more and more acceptance of women's studies. I think the women's movement has spread nationally, and people are beginning to think, well, if we're activists in the women's movement, why doesn't the university system teach us things that will be helpful in building this movement? But I think generally that's been slow, that everybody thinks that things are doing better in other places than in fact they are. And I think we in women's studies have to be real careful, or it's possible that we're going to be pushed out of the universities, although I think the women's movement is strong enough not to allow that to occur. I think that it will be a tough fight, and we're going to see those that fight in the next few years.
Yeah, there is, as you say, this interesting discrepancy between the growing respectability of women's studies nationally and the mean-spirited quality of individual and local campuses. Now, I think the mere fact that we're sitting here talking about it is one symptom of the fact that it's being nationally recognized. Foundations are setting up fellowship programs. Publishers are sponsoring journals. There are many other signs of women's studies gaining a kind of national respectability. It is no longer a national joke as it was 3 years ago. But for what you say about the local campus is absolutely right. And if we're going to talk about the ugly minutiae of harassment, I think we have to realize that there are techniques of harassing students, and there are techniques of harassing faculty, and there are techniques of harassing administrators who believe in it, and there are techniques of hassling librarians who want to order books. How are students harassed? Well, I had a male student, as a matter of fact, a boy who wanted to come take my class called Sexuality and Literature at Barnard College. A sweet boy, a nice boy, and an intelligent young man. He went to his advisor and said, I want to take Stimpson's course. And the advisor looked at him and stood up in all his 6-foot fury and said, what do you want to go across the street for and get your head blown off? So there's that kind of putting down of students' ambitions to take this course. As for faculty or administrators, the harassment there is, why are you doing work that's not going to help? It's like telling a doctor, why are you cutting grass instead of appendicitis? Or there's a very direct loss of jobs. That often what you will see is young faculty working for and initiating these courses, non-tenured faculty. And they are given rather direct punishment for doing this because they're thought to be doing non-serious and threatening work, and that is simply that their contracts are not renewed.
Is budget cuts another form of harassment, Liz?
Yeah, definitely, in terms of programs. But I think also individual courses get cut in departments, but programs around the country, and certainly in Buffalo right now, we're constantly threatened with budget cutbacks. And I think everybody can understand why this is, because university budgets are going down. But if you think about it, we run our program on $39,000 a year. Now, for them to talk about the whole university's budget is being cut, and therefore they take 5,000 from 39,000, that's like killing a program. And people say, well, everybody's being cut, instead of looking at the little tiny amount that we have to begin with and cutting back. So I think it's clear harassment, that kind of budget cut, because they could leave us with $39,000. But it's the principle of, well, if we constantly keep them fighting for that little bit, then they're always going to be on the defensive. And I think it's a strategy.
There's another treatment, isn't there, Liz, that we can't really dignify with the word harassment. And that's a kind of studied indifference, in which the really interesting work and the solid work and the good work that's being done to revitalize our knowledge of men and women is being ignored. And in a sense, people who are largely women, but some men, who are doing this kind of scholarship are told, go in your corner, sweet things, just don't bother us. It's a kind of intellectual indifference on the part of what we can call the intellectual establishment, which is in a sense their loss.
Well, I think it's worse than their loss. I think we suffered tremendously, because in a sense it's saying that the questions that are on our mind that we want to know the answers to, like basically what's been our history, how come we're in this position now, what's been the history of the feminist movement, how have women organized in the past, what were the punishments against rape, where did these rape laws come from, what is the history of childcare. We need to know the answers to those questions, and we think the world needs to know the answers to those questions. And they're saying, don't concern yourself with that. That's our lives, they're saying, that we shouldn't concern ourselves with. So I think it's even worse than, they're ignoring us and they're losing. I think we're losing terribly, because we're going to lose that fight to transform this society in general. And I think that's why all of us are so committed to women's studies. We understand we need that knowledge, and the world needs that knowledge.
It's interesting, isn't it? because the charge that's most often leveled against women's studies is trivial.
Right.
And those of us who are involved in it think that's probably the least accurate adjective can be applied. We can often be called in error because sometimes we make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes in thinking things through. We can often be called, you know, too slow or too fast, too quick to come to conclusions. There are all sorts of things that could accurately be said about us that we've probably said about ourselves. But to be called trivial is the least accurate way to describe it.
Let's talk for a minute about content of the programs. I mean, what do you think is important? What do you respect that's happening?
Well, I guess I'd start a little bit from our program and the vision of having 5 kinds of courses. That we need a general introductory course that talks about the realities of women's lives, and we start with a section called Who Are the Women of America? And we go through the fact that we as women, we're black women, we're white middle-class women, white working-class women, and lesbian women, and we try and bring that theme through the whole introductory course, analyzing the basic institutions. Then we have skills courses, courses that give women skills that they have been traditionally denied. We have theoretical courses, then courses that are feminist approaches to traditional disciplines, like women's history courses, women in literature courses. And then we have courses that we call fieldwork courses, where women go out and analyze the institutions that women are in, like analysis of the nursing profession or the health system, so that we begin to build up a broad curriculum that gives us some control over understanding the world that we're affected by. Now, most places have isolated courses, as we could see from the figures Kate opened with. And the problem with having isolated courses is that a department can say, well, that's our women's course. We don't have to deal with women in the 19th century or the 20th century in our normal courses because we have a women's history course. And I think that's a problem in terms of curriculum and content of education, that we've got to guard against getting isolated courses. We need those individual courses, but we have to make sure we get them into a general framework and begin to change each discipline.
Yeah, what are some of the other kind of problems that we know people are working on? There's work being done on occupational segregation. That is, what kind of work is being considered man's work, running TV cameras, for example. What kind of work is being considered women's work? There's interest, too, in how women have had a double burden of work, that they have been thought to do, they have been held responsible both for work outside of the home and for work within the home. And so we can see women, if we look at women in work, we can see women as double laborers, perpetually moonlighting, perpetually having often having 2 jobs. In terms of my own field, which is literature, there's a real interest among some of the best people in looking at women writers. And there are many more than we have ever known. There's a whole solid contribution of women to literature that we simply haven't recognized. We haven't looked at its depths, and we haven't looked at its complexities. I'm also very interested in the implications in terms of creating literature of a cultural notion that men are the agents of culture and women are the sweet creatures of nature, that men are the doers who write the books, who paint the paintings, who make the sculptures, and women don't. And I'm interested in terms of our notion of the arts, how this has affected us.
Well, another aspect of that I find real exciting is, first we looked at this, it's not men who are the agents of culture, but then we look at, well, who are the women who are agents of culture? And then we begin to understand that there have been women who've been agents of culture for 100 years or more, of course. And besides that some women are black women, and the agents for culture as black women are different from, let's say, you or me. And that's something that because I think we do a lot of work on that in Buffalo, because we see ourselves as responsible to a movement.
Is that typical, Liz, though, of women's studies programs across the country?
I think more and more women are beginning to demand that. I'm not sure how many programs have moved on it, but I think more and more women are saying, well, look, we want to know more, and we're not all the same. And that we have to know what our cultural, once we start looking at cultural heritage, we realize that different histories lead to different cultural heritage, and that our strength comes from getting together and meeting the different needs.
What about all women in women's studies classes? Now, this is a somewhat controversial issue. I'd like to know what you feel about it.
I think we should take that back one step, which is there a function, particularly now, of women working in groups together, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in a club, whether it's in a political group? Is there something good, something healthy that happens to women when they work together? And there seems to be something, yes, the answer seems to be positive. That at least in this point of time, and I think one of the things that the scholarship about women is uncovering is how much this operated in the past. That women working together as a group, as I say, whether it's in the classroom or outside of the classroom, are able to do good things. Now, men have always done this, and nobody said much about it except hooray, hooray. The football team in the Army, you know, oh boy, look at what those fellows can do together working in the football team in the Army. And so we've always been able to accept as having a certain social value, although I don't know about the Army, but we've been able to accept the utility of men working in groups together. We're beginning to see or rediscover the utility of women working in groups together. In my own particular classroom, I teach both men and women.
Liz, how do you feel about that? We have less than a minute.
Well, I think in our program we found it very successful, and I think we find that
But it's not an across-the-board thing.
no, it's not. But we find that in those classes which have only women, that there's a certain aspect to the class and a certain strength. And I think the program has found that the reason why it's so strong is that we never undercut the power that comes from women working together. And in fact, we're slowly trying to work to increase that and increase society's recognition of it and understand where that comes from.
Isn't it interesting how scared people are of women working together from time to time? And a
Right.
question, a question that the women's studies might address is, why are people, both men and women, so frightened of seeing women in groups together?
We'll have to answer that another time. We're out of time. Thank you both for being here. Thank you for watching, and good night.
Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.